So let's bring in the question of ethics. I mean, it's rising up in the Q&A. I mean, between the questions of appearance and things as they are, and modernism constructed itself or articulated itself, and even in its moorings to Nehruvian nationalism, as some kind of an ethical situating of the socius, a rethinking of times, right? I mean, so that was my, part of the motivation behind how things look modern and how things are modern is the differentiation. That was a important criteria. So what is the status of that, today, 70 years on, 50 years, 60 years on? Does that all become obsolete? Or is in a sense the ethical imperative of modernism or an Indian nationalism, and it's does it still stand, or is that to be critiqued? How do we produce that critique, Tony? Do you have thoughts on that? No. I mean, I'm trying to turn to this whole sort of climate question and the energy question. Is like, the sort of series of ethical internal critiques of modernism, which were started in the 60s and 50s, 60s, and 70s. These are still very much in play. But at the same time, there is also a kind of a dismissal and destruction of modernist architecture on its aesthetic grounds, which is that it is simply out of touch. So well, those two things, go ahead.
No, I think you're right in the sense that there is, on the one hand, devaluation, and certainly the word brutalist, which journalists picked up from the early critiques of modernity, didn't help the aesthetic evaluation of the buildings that are being threatened. But they are buildings that were built at a time when CIAM, after the war, was attempting to, as Jose Luis said, develop a new monumentality out of the rather abstract language of modernism. And that was being demonstrated in the new city halls. Think of Boston, the new skyscrapers, the new city centers. Think of Birmingham. All those infrastructural plus civic buildings are being built at that time as sort of restoring the center of the city, or as more viciously moving out the poor inhabitants from the centers of cities for business accommodations. But all those buildings are, in fact, were symbols of a certain kind of civic modernity. And two things are happening. One, land values are increasing to the point that the demolition and reconstruction is more economic in terms of profit than restoration, and they are literally obsolete. I mean, the Birmingham Library, for example, which is one of the triumphal modernist libraries in the 50s, was intimately linked to the inner ring road, which was also reinforced concrete. Once that inner ring road was deemed obsolete, the library had to go. It was all connected, right? So there's a certain moment where the total planning that was so important to the kind of interdisciplinary between urbanism, infrastructure, and architecture moment. You think of the new towns where all those things were linked. Once they became obsolete, or one item became obsolete, then land values became much more important. And also the triumph of neoliberal capitalism is much more important. I think on the other hand, though, I think that the sense of from now is that we, the crises that we're facing in terms of everything from pandemics to environment to major social crises, the major political crises, they kind of wipe out talk about aesthetics. They wipe out talk about the individual building. As long as you can make the individual building out of materials that are recyclable or renewable, as long as you can make it ethically reasonable in terms of the space requirements and the and it's, if you like, modesty in relationship to accommodation, then that's okay. And then beyond that, we are into a much, much more catastrophic stage of thought, apocalyptic stage of thought, where the small scale building, even the monument, and especially the monument, becomes completely out of the question. It's not a problem anymore.
We have some major nationalistic architecture being designed and built today. I mean, architecture is still being accessed as a, I don't know how the materials and recycled material question bears into this, but I think still there are major structures being built in Delhi and in other parts of the world as the expression of a new nationalism. But this is a nationalism that does not index itself to the 19th, early 20th century modernist idea of nationalism. So what happened here? Go ahead, Sunil.
Yeah, I mean, I think that lots of things to say about that, but I mean, just a couple that I'll throw in at this point. I mean, I think here one has to recall the historically complex relationship between, or rather, historical complexity of the politics of modernism. And aesthetic modernism very often went with reactionary politics. Wyndham Lewis, Ezra Pound, etc., Corbusier himself. This idea that you could be aesthetically at the edge of things, but your politics harks back to a world of order, a world of where people knew their place, of deference, of authority. Corbusier's figure of the regulator, the administrative political figure who would keep everything in order. And in a curious way, I mean, I think that what you're seeing today in India is, is you're seeing a kind of that strand of modernism actually finding some life. So in a combination of, someone like Modi and his chief architect Bimal Patel, I mean, you see this combination of this distinct, to use the terms you used earlier, being modern and looking modern. You see the desire to look modern, and to pick up to combine a certain kind of technological aesthetics, a kind of IIT aesthetics, with reactionary politics, and I think I think the difference there between the earlier moment of nationalism and the current moment, very broadly put, might be put this way, which is that in the earlier moment with Nehru and others and his generation, I think there was a sense that the state had a kind of gently corrective role in terms of the society. So if you look at the Indian Constitution and the early decades of the state, the project was to gradually, patiently move the society in a more just, more fair, more open and democratic direction. The current view of what the function of the state is that somehow it should be expressive of the society as it is, that it's not this gently corrective function, but it should be expressive of some definition of the culture or some claimed view of the majority, that's the function of what the state is, and therefore the architecture of the state and the products of the state should be some authentic expression of, rather than some, you know, in a sense, pedagogically sort of process of directing the society gently in a particular way. And I think you know, that there's been this shift that now the state belongs to the real people, the authentic voice of the people, and that voice must be heard in all its instances, built, ideological, etc.
Yeah. So, and what is your thinking about that? I mean, so what is the purpose of this? Yeah, of this. Where is the state today? I mean, in globalization, is the state become a loudspeaker, or sort of it always had that sort of loudspeaker kind of quality to it. I mean, they were you know, all kinds of representations of the state in the 19th and early 20th century. So why did this happen? I mean, how did we go from that 50s, 60s corrective to here? I mean, is it because that corrective kind of role of the state didn't work, did fail, or what happened here?
That would need several volumes of
several yeah, no, it's true.
Partha has a go on that.
Partha has a handle. Yeah.
Now, so on a slightly different note, if we look at things globally, I mean, earlier, as you say, mid-century modernism, it was propelled by optimism about science. You have to continuously innovate, and there was no end to it. You go on continuously. Recently, with all the crises, environmental crisis, you know, lots of other globalization problems, what you have is that a whole lot of thinkers have started to question this kind of optimism. I now think of actual scientists. They haven't grappled with the problem of what do we do with teleology? Where do we, I mean, is ethics more important than just going forward, building newer things? So that's been a very important issue. Like water shortage in India, let's take a very interesting example. I mean, initially these things didn't matter in the 60s. Now there's tremendous water crisis. So these are important issues for engineering, environmental, you know, science, and lots of other things where attention has shifted to other things as well. And a whole lot of writings now about these, questioning strongly these ideas. I mean, you know this, I mean, it's happening both in arts and sciences. So I think that's an important dimension we need to think about the present day. You know, you have to, Anthropocene, you know, problems, they have to be certainly confronted.
Right.
I'd like to add something to Sunil's point, if I could. And you may correct me on this, putting this in there, just a thought bubble, maybe as a footnote. So when Clinton visited India, he arrived at the airport and they picked him up in a limousine and brought him straight to the Parliament building, and he gave a speech. And Mrs. Clinton was sent off to the Taj Mahal all by herself as sort of the accompanying, you know, lady, you know, doing the tourist stuff. And of course, she complained bitterly, you know, about that. It was a completely different story when Obama came. So Obama came and the limousine picked him up, and they went to Humayun's tomb, which had just been, you know, restored under UNESCO.
Restored. Yeah.
And and Prime Minister Singh and his wife met him there, along with the head of the agricultural department in India. And they had a whole tour about the grandeur and the grandioseness and how wonderful India was of the past. And after they had gotten the good dose of this history, they got back into the limo, and then Obama went to the Parliament building to give his talk. And I think these, you know, the moments, it's about 10 years difference is remarkably, accurate, if you will, in positing the rise of a type of historical consciousness within the nationalist project in India, for sure, but one that also had become quite global, right under the guise of liberalism. So this is the point. We see these things as sort of extreme nationalism, but this often happened with the acquiescence of the liberal intelligentsia. So in other words, who doesn't want history to be valuable? And people sort of didn't complain that, certain buildings had all of a sudden become national symbols. People don't complain that Jomon archaeological sites in India are made and constructed.
Japan, you mean? Yeah.
I'm sorry, in Japan, purely as instruments of the nation state. And, so it's a confusing attitude that many liberal intellectuals had, because they wanted, these historical things to be valued and be preserved, and this all sounded very good, but then you have to look who's paying the bill. And all of a sudden, no one seemed to really notice that for a long time. And now all of a sudden, people are getting a little uncomfortable, as they should, but they should have gotten uncomfortable, 20 years ago.
I'm speculating as to what would have happened if Donald Trump had visited Modi.
He did. He did.
He did. So what was his trajectory?
It was a stadium event.
There you go.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.